What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the Ben Stewart Podcast. Today we have with us Harrison Schultz. He's a martial artist with a specialty in capoeira and a founding member of Occupy Wall Street. He has a PhD in sociology, and he's currently promoting his annual November 5th demonstration at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Today we'll be discussing his time at Occupy Wall Street and why he split ways with the movement due to his belief that they should instead have been occupying the Fed. Stick around for an incredible deep dive on the Fed and what solutions we can engage with before the possible dreaded end of the American empire and the dollar as we know it, right here on the Ben Stewart Podcast. My man Harrison, how you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me here, Ben. Thanks for the intro. Great to be here.
Yeah, man. It's good to have you here. This is going to be a cool conversation. This will actually be the first time that we've done a deep dive on the Fed, talked about Occupy Wall Street. And, but the first thing I want to hop into is tell us just a little bit about like yourself, a little bit of your backstory and how you landed at sociology PhD, but then the Fed specifically, from Occupy Wall Street to the Fed. Tell us about this chain of events that eventually led you here, because as you and I have talked over the past few days about the Fed, we've really gotten into some details that have helped me realize, damn, I would have been one of those cats that said, I've looked up the Fed. I understand the Fed. And now I come to the understanding that I have far more questions than answers. So please give us a little bit of the backstory that led you up to really finding the Fed to be the number one thing we should all be looking at.
Occupy Wall, great question, $1 trillion question. Occupy Wall Street led me directly to the Fed. Long story short, I never would have gotten into the Fed without Occupy Wall Street. Before I go any further, just to tell you a bit about me, I'm totally psychedelic. legalization activists too. Occupy led to all sorts of stuff. So I know this is a psych-friendly show, so I thought I'd take a little microdose of psilocybin just to kick things off. Yeah. Going back down memory lane with a little memory trip. So I got into Occupy Wall Street because of student debt, just to get back to that. So, I mean, I kind of grew up on the left. I'm a third generation anarchist. My grandmother, she taught feminist reading study groups with Emma Goldman, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So this stuff has always been with me. Long history. I mean, I'm a direct descendant of the direct descendant and survivor of the United Nation of Indians, everything that goes along with that. So, I mean, like, I've always been like paying attention. I've always been into this stuff. I've always been asking critical questions. And that led me, you know, I wanted to study sociology. That got me into grad school. Wanted to go to New York because I got some of the best capoeira, some of the best sociology in the world. I went out there, started racking up mad debt. How the hell am I going to pay for this? I was reading Adbusters because I was working in the advertising industry of all things. I'm an anarchist, working in the advertising industry with like a guilty conscience. So I started reading Adbusters, looking for ways to try to apply some of this advertising stuff to the movement. And then I saw that Bull and the Ballerina poster, advertising Occupy Wall Street. Started looking online, saw that there was some actual meetings in New York. I mean, I thought, yeah, like, hey, why not Occupy Wall Street? Like, right? You know, like, why wouldn't we? Like, why wouldn't we try to shut that down? Like, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
You know, I remember the Battle of Seattle when I was a kid growing up in the 90s, and I thought that would be fun. At this point, I had just gotten a job, another advertising industry. So I was like, well, maybe I can kind of work around on the side. I probably won't be sleeping down there too much. But I found it online. I started going down. I thought it was probably going to be a disaster, honestly, when I first got involved. But then, I mean, just meeting a few other people, making some friends in the group, some people who were really dedicated, really committed, people who knew more than I did. I just got sucked in. And then next thing we knew, this thing was huge and we were all over the media. And so I slept down there a few times, but I was working with like the tech people. I was working with the website occupywallstreet.org, doing analytics for the website, just like I would have for any other corporation I was working for. And so they also had me doing media interviews. I was something of an unofficial spokesperson for occupywallstreet.org. And so one time I was on an interview on a radio station while at work with some channel in Wyoming. And in Wyoming, they one of the guests asked me if I knew anything about the Fed, and I didn't know what to say. I was like, well, I don't think it's very federal. I don't know why they call it the Fed, but I got more to look up. And so I just like I didn't want to get stumped again, and so I started looking deeper into this. I heard about the Fed. One other guy. There were a lot of Ron Paul people around OWS, kind of talking about the Fed, ending it, gold standard stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of my comrades, Richie, he wanted to talk about the Fed at one of the early Tompkins Square meetings. I remember like when he put the Fed on stack, all these other occupiers were just like, what? Why do you want to talk about that? What's that got to do with capitalism? And I was one of them. Like back then, I was like, what the fuck? Like, you some racist or something? Like, what? Like, the Fed? What does that have to do with this? So anyway, then I got stumped on that Wyoming show, and I was like, well, I should look into this, and I started asking questions. Somehow I got hooked up with David Korten through someone at Occupy Wall Street, the economist David Korten. I wrote out an interview for him. We did it on some like tin can and shoestring like podcast system, nothing like this. This is 2011. We were still kind of pushing the edge on some of this stuff. But I did an interview with him, and that's when I learned that the Wall Street banks would have collapsed in 2008 without the Fed bailing them out. And this is sort of the recession of 2008 we're referring to. And so that was sort of the beginning. I understood that the Federal Reserve was really the Reserve Bank of Wall Street rather than, the federal government. And from there, just little by little, gradually. I mean, I tried to get people within Occupy Wall Street to focus on the Fed, like as soon as I understood that, and I tried, but the momentum was just in too many other places to really start a conversation about the Fed. 2013 was the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And that's when I did my first demonstration at the Fed for the 100th anniversary. We did that in tandem with some of the public banking people, Ellen Brown's group. They want public banks. They occupied the San Francisco Fed. We occupied the New York City Fed simultaneously. And we got some press with RT for that. And I've been doing demonstrations down at the Federal Reserve for years now since then. I mean, there would be a huge crowd at the Fed if I could get all the people I've had trickle down there all there at once. But and since then, I've just been learning more and more. I've kind of made this something of a specialty for myself, and I'm really happy to be here just to have this conversation. This is what I do, so.
Yeah, well, really appreciate you being here. It's interesting you mentioned the Oneida Indian Nation. Two things. There's the guest Todd Vincent that we had on. He lives down here. He's the fermented farmer, and he's the only other person that I had met from the Oneida Indian Nation that doesn't that obviously, like, you would have to say you're Oneida, because back in 2011, it might have been 2010, I met with the head of the Oneida Indian Nation, or I'm sorry, the head of the Oneida Indian Nation's brother, Barry Halbritter. Oh, cool. And he showed me all throughout the Oneida Indian Nation, and you can't really see it, but right here is a chanupa, and it's maybe I'll just grab it for you.
Is it the New York Oneida Nation or Wisconsin one, first off? Oh, there you go.
New York Oneida Indian Nation.
This is New York. I'm in Wisconsin. I'm out in Wisconsin.
Okay, right on. So out of Oneida, New York is where they were.
Beautiful.
And so anyway, like, they gifted me that chanupa for the work that I was doing. That was Esoteric Agenda, Kymatica. But I just find that interesting. You mentioned the Oneida, and I don't come across many people who actually understand who the Oneida are, let alone actually have that kind of blood connection to them. So, and then on top of that, it's interesting that you mention right around that time frame of Occupy Wall Street, the housing bubble and everything like that. That's the start of something that I brought up on Timcast last year. It would have been like my very first time where I was talking about the fourth turning, which is Strauss-Howe's generational theory of every 80 to 90 years, there's a crisis period. And once it starts, it will not go longer than 20 years or shorter than 15 years. And they called it, they said 2005, give or take 3 years before or after, you're going to see the start of the crisis. So there's going to be an inciting incident. So the housing bubble and everything around the housing bubble, including Occupy Wall Street and why that became a thing, was really the initial inciting incident. So it's interesting to have you, one of the founding members and probably one of the more vocal members out there, here talking about this today. So that brought you to the Fed. What I want to understand is, for those who don't understand the Fed, it's probably hard to put into a soundbite, but just explain to us, what is the Fed and who does the Fed answer to?
Before we get into the question, let me just say it was great to see you on Timcast just a couple days ago with Tim looking like Dr. Evil with Mr. Broncos there.
Yeah.
Really interesting. You talk about like how every 90 years it seems like there's a crisis. And I remember on that show you were talking about like you talk about like a 250-year average span for empire.
Yeah.
Which also sounds very which makes a lot of sense. And I think there's that theory, those cycles. My favorite book on the Fed, before we get started, a lot of the stuff that I come up with this is all from a book called The Lost Science of Money by Steven Zarlanga. And this goes even back before the Fed. This is the origins of the Fed all the way to ancient Greece.
Wow.
So this whole rise, and this is a monetary view of the rise and fall of all the great dominant Western civilizations, including our own here in this country. And the bottom line, I mean, like, we're not Marxists. We don't view history as the result of necessarily bourgeoisie and proletariat. It's bankers. This is the banking class. They've been setting up central banks and running these con games for as long as our history goes. In fact, our history maybe even started from these people screwing us over. And there's a long history, and it leads up to the Federal Reserve. So to get to work now, what is the Fed? It's the Federal Reserve is a debt trap. It's a debt scheme. It's slavery. The Federal Reserve is debt. That's all it does. It makes debt. It makes us think, and it pays for media to trick us into thinking that this debt is somehow actual money, which it is not. Long story short, the Fed is debt, and therefore it is death.
Interesting. Okay, so the second part of that was, who does the Fed answer to? How what's the conventional wisdom of who the Fed is supposed to answer to? Who keeps the Fed in check? And what it sounds like you're alluding to is even that's an illusion.
The Federal Reserve is the Federal Reserve is the Reserve Bank of Wall Street. The Federal Reserve answers to Wall Street. Wall Street is the monetary authority of this country that controls the Federal Reserve. However, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was passed by a very ignorant, very deceived Congress, and was passed on December 23rd, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, when no one had time to study this bill. There's doubts over who even wrote the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and it was confirmed that this bill was written at a secret meeting in Jekyll Island. The creature from Jekyll Island, we're all familiar. Hopefully your audience is familiar with this, but this bill was written by a private cartel of bankers led by Paul Warburg. Yep. Yeah. And they tricked William Jennings Bryan, and they tricked Woodrow Wilson into getting the Democrats to push this bill through our political apparatus, and they got it passed. And both Jennings Bryan and Woodrow Wilson deeply regretted their involvement in passing this bill. So it looks legit. A lot of people think it's legit. Democrats think it's legit. Even people on the radical left think it's legit. But it's the biggest single just sham. It's the single biggest trick. And once you figure it out, once you see just how stupid the trick is, you feel kind of dumb about all the decisions you've made in your life. Because you know that it all comes down to money, and like you just see how the fakeness, like the artificiality of life, it all comes from the Fed. Like all the toxicity, the interpersonal toxicity in our relationships, it all starts from our toxic monetary supply. Like the Fed has corrupted everything since its inception. None of us alive, none of our parents, none of our grandparents, none of us really knows what real money is. None of us have ever had real money. None of us have ever lived in a true monetary system. We've lived in a debt slavery system. And it's really important that we're asking these questions, because there's a lot to talk about. I can lose my focus pretty easily here.
So my question, like, here is, as obvious and insidious as it seems when we start to wake up to this trap of debt, it's not very obvious what to do about it. And we'll get into solutions towards the end.
Yeah.
But it's, even for me, somebody who I'm an avid reader about things along these lines, and as soon as we start talking about these things, I'll scour from the left to the right side of the political spectrum, from the top to the down. What is there to actually even do in this scenario? So, like, you know, it does feel, yes, there's a dumbness, there's a stupidity to it, there should be this obviousness to it, but in a sense, for so many people, there's not. And I know economists that I've even spoken to that say, like, it's so convoluted and tricky now. Maybe it would have been easier back in 1913 to, like, you know, nip this thing in the bud. But I'm also curious if nipping that one in the bud wouldn't have meant that 1914 rolls around and something else under a new name gets kind of pushed under. It almost feels like, because I guess a part of my question, and I wasn't going to ask this till later, but, you know, how much do you think these problems would have happened regardless whether or not the Fed existed or not? Because don't you feel that some groups, especially groups of power, no matter what country they're in, no matter what political or governing system they're in, they simply look to exploit loopholes and siphon power, wealth, whatever, to them at the expense of others. And it can't, maybe I wouldn't say it can't, but it almost feels like even an altruistic system can be twisted by opportunists. So what are your thoughts on, like, is this a group of people, or is this human nature?
It's a group of people. It's specific groups of people, specific countries over time. And this book names some names. It's definitely bigger than the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. But I mean, it's Paul Warburg. He's the guy who started this. Like, he was paid for by the Rothschilds to come over here and start teaching about monetary stuff. It's not human nature. It's human. It's banking nature. It's definitely greed. It's definitely power, and it's definitely knowledge. There's a lost science of money, a lost science of banking that most people don't have access to, and that these people do. And this lost science of money, I mean, Stephen Zarlenga in this book, he argues that this has been deliberately censored over the ages. One of the great quotes from the book I love in the first chapter: you can find detailed information about how the garbage was collected in ancient Athens, but search in vain to find out how the coinage worked. Like, this stuff gets deliberately censored. I mean, this stuff gets deliberately convoluted. I mean, a lot of what you find out in Stephen Zarlenga's book, I mean, the reason why I like this book is because instead of focusing on, like, kind of abstract conspiracies and stuff, he really focuses on the con games. He really breaks down the different tricks, like the way that, so I mean, obviously, let's go back to the beginning a little bit, since we want to get bigger here. Before I start off by this, just want to preface by saying, solutions. It is far easier to understand what the good news here is, that it's far easier to understand what to do about the Fed than it actually is to understand the Fed itself.
Interesting.
I am an academic. Like, I can do the work on, like, breaking down the Fed and all that, but there's not enough time for that. I'm in organizer mode. It's far easier just to pitch the NEAT Act, do the social media, raise awareness for this bill, then start the conversation. And it is even to tell people what to do about this. And we got to focus on the activism side more so. But it's important to get some history down and to start with some fundamentals. The other thing, too, is that when it comes to understanding the Fed, I feel that taking an economics angle is the wrong way to go. Like, when you want to understand the Fed, you want to take more of a criminological angle. Like, this is just crime. This is, if you start to, like, take the jargon seriously, if you start to take, like, okay, the dual mandate is unemployment and it's, you know, inflation, and, like, they buy treasury bonds, and if you start to like take their terms seriously, you automatically get pulled away from the con game, from the heist, from the central debt and carrot and string operation that the Fed is. So let's go back to ancient history. According to Zarlenga, the money used to be alive. All right, seeds were the first form of money. Cows were often used as money. Anything can be used as money as long as it's decreed by law, according to Aristotle. Money exists by law, not by nature. So what would happen is a neighbor would loan some seeds or some cows to their other neighbor. If that neighbor had a good harvest, or the cow gave birth, it was common to return some extra grain or some extra offspring to that original lender, just for loaning the original seed. This is where interest started. Priest bankers come along. The first bankers were priests, the temples, and these priests, they started hoarding gold. They had all this extra gold, and they started loaning out gold. And the weird thing that happened in human history is that when these priests would loan out gold, they would expect a little bit more gold back, as though it were alive, and, like, as if the gold could, like, have sex and, like, reproduce and create more gold. You know what I mean? We call this the usury era. This is the first form of usury.
Yeah.
Okay.
Usury, by what we mean by usury, you don't mean just simple charging of excessive interest. That's just one of many forms,
right?
Usury is, that's a form of extortion, but there's many different forms of usury. When we talk about usury, we mean the systematic misuse of the monetary system for personal gain. That's what we're talking about. Okay. And so this was gold. Using gold as money was the first form of usury that these bankers practiced. This is how bankers took control of, like, ancient Greek city-states and started causing all kinds of wars between ancient Greek city-states like Sparta and Athens and etc. And so flash forward, let's talk about ancient Rome for a minute. Rome, originally the rise of ancient Rome was due to the bronze money that they used, the Roman ace. Actually, let me back up a little bit. Let's talk about ancient Sparta for a second. Of all the great ancient Greek city-states, ancient Sparta, Lycurgus, the mythical lawgiver, maybe existed, maybe didn't. He supposedly came around, and the thing he did, he banished all the gold and silver because he saw what this was doing in other ancient Greek city-states. And instead of the gold, he created the Pelennor monetary system with these iron bars, and he watered them down and soaked them in vinegar after they heated up. So the iron itself was useless. And these huge iron bars, like no one wanted to carry them around. Like, so the most important thing about these bars, though, is there's a set amount in society. There's a set finite amount of these. So they weren't getting overinflated. They weren't getting deflated.
Right.
But all of a sudden, I mean, like, supposedly the story, according to Plutarch, is that like all the crime in Athens vanished, all the prostitution is gone, like all the con games, all the theater, like all the hustles that people use to make money, because all of a sudden now there's no debt in the society. These bars are just sort of freely issued. Mind you, this is still a slave society. They've still enslaved like the whole Helot class. But this is Lycurgus was supposedly like the first monetary reformer. So now with this monetary system, Spartans has time to focus on agriculture and training for war. And this is when they achieve their big military achievements, when they're not worried about money.
I want to pause you right there because there's a question that I have. It goes back to actually, so Tim Poole talks about this a lot, Thucydides Trap. I mentioned it in Esoteric Agenda 2. Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian who said the rise of Athens and the fear that it instilled in Sparta made war inevitable. And, you know, Thucydides Trap, just because I said it, I'll explain it, basically means that when there is a major superpower and a rising superpower starts swiftly coming up in the ranks, then the major superpower 12 times out of 16 historically has waged war. And that was what people were thinking United States would do on China, because back in the early 70s, China was third world. Actually, for even 20 or so years after that, still considered third world. And now all of a sudden they're neck and neck as a superpower. So that's Thucydides' trap. But Thucydides said that about Athens and Greece. And because you mentioned that, my curiosity is almost going back to like the Game of Thrones concept, where like all this war and history of war is happening. But what is the one most stable power in that world? It was the bank. And you rarely see it. You rarely hear from the bankers. You see them in like 2, maybe 3 scenes out of the entire series. And the entire time, the most stable institution or the most stable group is the bank. So it's interesting. My question is, do you think, and only if you have some kind of understanding of this, you know, make a solid statement about it, but like it almost sounds like if banking is this trap, that the war between Athens and Sparta is almost like what happened with De Beers in the rival in Africa, the rival tribes. De Beers would give one side of them guns so they can start killing off the other side, and in return for those guns, they wanted this tribe to mine for diamonds. And then once this other side that's getting killed off is almost gone, then all of a sudden you start giving them guns and taking the guns away from the other side, so now they can start dominating, and in turn they give them the diamonds. So basically, is that a parallel to Athens and Greece, or Athens and?
You already know what I'm about to say. All wars are bankers' wars. Spartan, okay. That's no different. Spartan was like Spartan trained their ass up, but they're at relative peace when they had the Pelennors, when they had these iron bars. They started their major wars with Athens once they switched to systems of gold and silver money, like the rest of Greece. When they had their iron Pelennors, they were monetarily isolated. They could they have their own infrastructure. Once they switched to monetary systems of gold, they're hooked up into an international system now. And now their affairs can be directly influenced by the treasurers of the gods. The original Wall Street was called the treasurers of gods, according to Stephen Zarlang, and this was the ancient Greek company. You can read all about it in Lost Science, man. And these people move money all around, causing all kinds of wars between these states. So, but you could see the exact same thing happen in ancient Rome. So, the second king of Rome, King Numus, he's a very pious king, and he was chosen specifically to bring peace to Rome. And he was a descendant of the Spartan colony of Sabine. And so he knew about the Pelennor system. And so when King Numa created the monetary system for Rome, he used it bronze instead of gold. And this is when Rome focused on building all the aqueducts, the roads, the agriculture. This is when like Rome created its infrastructure and like focused on peace. Once they're locked into the Punic Wars, once Hannibal started marching around the Roman countryside with the elephants and all that, and he started taking up bronze Roman money and using bronze money to fund raids against Rome itself. Then the Romans, all of a sudden, during the midst of this war, during the midst of the chaos, then they switched to the gold and the silver denarius. Once you switch to gold and silver, now all of a sudden, in order to keep your economy flowing, in order to keep your empire going, now you need mines, now you need new lands, now you need new slaves. Just like oil. If your dollar is linked to the petrodollar, then you have to play that oil game.
Yeah, you mentioned it.
So the main theme of the Lost Science of Money is that government issued money, public money. When the government issues their own money, like the way they should, that's when you get infrastructure. Once the infrastructure gets built up, that's when the banks start a war. They hijack control over the monetary system. And that's when they force you to start using their debt rather than the government's money. It's the same thing in the US. We could talk about the continental currencies. We could talk about the greenbacks. We got to talk about the continentals and the greenbacks at some point too. But it's the same story within Western civilization. Public money, when the government issues money, everything rises. Then the banks take over. Boom, everything falls. And it seems to take between 90 and 250 years for a bank to like really kind of pull this off.
That's interesting because 90 years is one turning, you know. So it's the fourth turning. So it's one full crisis cycle, and 250 years is the life expectancy of an empire. By the way, I got a shout out to the United States. 2026 is our 250th birthday. So curious, are you saying that part of the scheme is to allow for governmental internal money to build the infrastructure, and then once the infrastructure is built, then you swoop in and take it? So let them build their infrastructure, then take it over.
You got to have something to take over. I mean, these bankers, like, they can't
collateral.
They have to start with some value that's already there. That's how it seems. That's what it looks like when you read The Lost Science of Money, when you get into this book. And that's why I love this book compared to like other stuff like The Creature from Jekyll Island or even Debt, David Graeber's book, The First 5,000 Years. It's like, what the best thing about this book, just to kind of keep it positive, is the NEAT Act I told you about before. So that was written by Dennis Kucinich, who in 2011 had the NEAT Act created, and he had the NEAT Act created specifically after he read The Lost Science of Money by Stephen.
What does that stand for, by the way?
The National Emergency Employment Defense Act, the NEAT Act. Yeah. And so this book would take our monetary system back from the private bankers. It would put it back under the Treasury, back under the Constitution like it belongs, and we would get money spent on public infrastructure, like real money, not this funny debt, Fed money, greenbacks, constitutional, continental currencies. That's what we want again. That's what made America great in the first place, and that's what it's gonna take to make America great again. Not a new candidate, real currency.
Yeah, and I want to get to those solutions, but the almighty YouTube algorithm says keep the carrot in front of the donkey. and keep people watching till the end. So we'll talk about solutions at the end. That's, just a little bit of humor for everybody.
We just got to throw a little positivity to keep them
yeah,
dangling.
but we need to keep going with the fear before we get to the solution. So let's keep talking about how shitty shit has gotten.
Let's get to it. Let's get to work.
We're mentioning like slavery, and it's interesting because there's a place I want to take this because of all the racial tensions today. But like everything built atop slavery, and there's this other part of this thing that we're talking about today is that it's almost like, well, things have never been better than where they're at today. Like, look, we don't have slavery anymore. We've abolished all of that. And, we're trying to, how should I say it, own the injustices of our past. So, undoing not just slavery, but like also racism and things along those lines. All of this, it has a great PR story to it, and I definitely think there's much that we need to own. My personal take on the racial tensions is we need to mourn together. We need to understand the shared struggles, not just throw money at the problem or upend the power struggle and put other people on top. I think there's a unity and a harmony that's needed between people rather than just a tipping of the scales in the opposite direction. But as we're talking about this, you asked me a question a few days ago, and we had it written out, like, what would happen if BLM looked up the Fed? I want you to dive into that because, like, Black Lives Matter, the notion of that is no brainer. Of course, life matters, and like to zero in like may be a way to get us to diagnose an issue. So I take no issue with that word, but my curiosity is, do you feel that the Black Lives Matter movement would come into a deeper clarity and a focus if they were to look at the Fed rather than, well, what would you say they're looking at now as being the core problem?
Let me say something really politically incorrect that needs to get said. This country, the United States of America, is still a slave society precisely because Black communities are every bit as monetarily illiterate as their enslaved ancestors in bondage were literally illiterate. Inflation, the federal, you cannot understand the history of racism in this country without also understanding the history of the Fed. It's the same history, right? Wow. I mean, Black Lives Matter needs you're not, if you're a Black person and you're not paying attention to the Fed, you are suicidal as far as I'm concerned. Like, if you're Black, you have twice as much incentive to pay attention to these monetary policies that are disproportionately affecting your communities. And I mean, we talk about Black Lives Matter in this country. We can talk about Black Lives Matter in the rest of the world as well. When the Fed raises interest rates like it is now, predominantly Black people, brown people in places like Sri Lanka and Brazil are starving and dying from lack of medicine and food and infrastructure. And right now, Black communities in this country are disproportionately suffering inflation like they always have. I mean, this is the same story. 70s, right after the Civil War, this wartime inflation, it always means Black people are going to starve more. And Black communities need to understand that the Fed is the race issue. If critical race, to my knowledge, critical race theory doesn't even talk about the Fed, doesn't even talk about the history of the central banks. Like, you can't understand how we got to this point without understanding, you can't understand slavery in this country without understanding the Federal Reserve was funded by the Bank of England. The Bank of England owned slaves itself. It had slaves doing labor for them, and it invested heavily in the slave trade. The Bank of England was funded initially by the Bank of Amsterdam, and the Bank of Amsterdam created the loans that the Dutch East India Company used to actually start transporting enslaved Africans from Africa to the colonies. So, like, you can't understand the history of slavery in this country without also understanding the history and the role of the central banks.
Wow.
And moreover, the main reason why you need to nationalize the Fed and end this fractional reserve lending and spend money into existence, the main reason why Black Lives Matter needs to pay attention to the NEED Act is because the Need Act is the best way for us to get reparations to victims of modern day slavery. Inflation is slavery, first off. Inflation is debt slavery. Inflation isn't bondage. It's not whips. It's not lashes. It looks more humane, but it'll still kill you. It looks a little bit more dignified. It doesn't look as bad in the media, the history textbook, but inflation is still slavery. It is still debt slavery. It's still going to kill you. And the thing is that we can get reparations for these communities without having to tax rich people, without having to tax self-made entrepreneurs, bypassing this bill, by nationalizing these banks. We can get money to communities that are hard up for cash so that they don't have to engage in black market activities in order to survive and meet the same standards as white communities.
Could you explain that quick? Like, what does that look like? What does it look like for reparations to come from a, I want to get the language right. If the Fed were to be taken back over by the government, how would you explain that? The Fed being taken back over by the government, or is there like a term for that? Like not central or not private, but
nationalized.
Nationalized. Okay, yeah. So what does that look like? Reparations coming from a nationalized Federal Reserve. What would that look like that couldn't be done with the Federal Reserve as it is today?
It means that black communities could get their money without white communities getting taxed, or without the value of money going down because there's too much money being produced.
Okay, because inflation is putting more money, supposedly putting more money into circulation, but that's what it looks like. It's not money, as you were saying, it's more debt.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, when we're talking about inflation in our economy, we're talking about there's too much debt being used as money in our economy.
Okay.
Right. That's an important distinction. But inflation means too much money. We don't have real money. We have debt. Those are two different problems related in one system. Deflation means too little money, and deflation historically is more lethal. And what we see is the bankers do this all the time. So like Zarlanga breaks it down, the Great Depression, before that we had the Roaring 20s, low interest rates, money, spike that octane, boom, put as much money, bankers put as much money out there as they can into the system. And then as it starts to inflate, as the money, right before the money starts to become worthless, boom, they snap on the brakes. They raise interest rates just like we're seeing now, and they start to deflate the currency. Now, once they raise that interest rates and there are all that money out there, they borrowed at low rates. Now they're in debt. Now you have all that money out there. You raise the rates. Now they have to pay back even more money than they thought they were initially.
Okay, and there's two other things I want to get to, but I almost want to, because we're talking about inflation, explain hyperinflation related to inflation. And you mentioned Sri Lanka, you mentioned Brazil, you look at Zimbabwe, you look at Germany, there's other examples. Explain to us hyperinflation, because I want to understand, like, where's the US at? Are we close?
Yeah, we are close. So hyperinflation is, I'd have to Google the exact definition, but it's when your currency, the amount of your currency in your system is expanding at twice the rate at whatever. I don't know. It means double-digit inflation, essentially. It means that inflation is running out of control. Prices are getting way higher than any ordinary person can pay. So usually this happens when your country's in debt. And so like Brazil or Sri Lanka, they're already in debt. And now they're just creating more money to pay off the debt that they're in. And so they're creating more money, that all the money that they're creating, it's becoming increasingly worthless because it's not being used to invest in infrastructure. It's just getting sucked right out of the communities.
Yeah. I just want to go through this because for those listening, I talked to Harrison earlier today. He mentioned hyperinflation, and I slammed on the brakes consciously. I was like, whoa, I'm going to take a look at this. For anyone who saw my videos about 2A and gun rights, I went through a very brief history of countries being disarmed and what happens immediately afterwards. I want to go into this Weimar Republic of Germany after World War I printed more money to get their economy working in any capacity that it could. And with reckless printing of money and borrowing, hyperinflation came. Hungary, 1945, over half the nation's buildings and businesses were destroyed after World War I, or World War II, I should say. Directed money through private banks to rebuild. Money creation and borrowing saw that the value of their money doubled every 15 hours. Doubled every 15 hours to reach hyperinflation. So then there's Yugoslavia in 1992, breakdown of the Soviet Union, conflict in Croatia and Bosnia, industrial capacity reduced. United Nations put a trade embargo on Yugoslavia, so they printed more money, they borrowed, hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, 2007, North Korea, 2009, Venezuela, 2016, same story over and over and over again. So, I mean, the two primary causes, I Googled this, of hyperinflation are, and Google knows, you know, I'll bow to Google. Two primary causes of hyperinflation are, one, an increase in money supply not supported by actual economic growth, which increases inflation. And number two, a demand pull inflation in which demand outstrips supply. So, you know, what you did to actually drive that point home, and maybe Gordo, you can pull up some pictures of this. Go to Germany hyperinflation and pull up some of the pictures of like just huge vats of paper money.
People got to see these.
Kids making like towers like their toys of stacks and stacks and stacks of money. If you saw Zeitgeist, people, you know, he was talking in there about people were burning it to just stay warm. They were burning cash. There's this one about Zimbabwe hyperinflation where there's a sign over bathrooms saying only toilet paper can be flushed, no newspapers, no Zim dollars, and, you know, no like whatever other kinds of paper.
Can't wipe your ass in money.
Right? It becomes worth more than the money.
Look at these kids, like you know, they're rolling in the dough, but it means nothing. And like these images, they should burn themselves into your memories. For the audience who's watching, look at these fucking images right here.
Look.
And like, it's what's curious about it is really asking the question: is this just fear porn, or is this actually very close to being real in this country? Is it like, because the questions, when I went through that list of all the different countries that reached hyperinflation, the podcaster right afterwards was like, but you know, you can just say like, all the telltale signs are there for the United States, but maybe it's different for us. Maybe for some reason we have some magic formula, or we're too big to fail, or, you know, there's some way that it's just not going to go the same route for the United States.
I'm pretty sure Captain Cook of the Titanic said something similar.
Yeah.
It's too big of a ship. Man, we're too special. We're too good to sink.
Yeah,
not
arrogance.
Us.
Right. You know, and so that, I just wanted to pause on that for the audience, because like the question is like, how close are we? You can find a YouTuber any day of the week saying hyperinflation is already here, or it's right around the corner. And then you have other people saying, don't listen to them. This is just a minor correction in the market. My curiosity is to you, how do we know, or does it even, is it useful to put a magnifying glass over that, like you said, you know, to fully understand the complexity of this issue? Or do you think the real play is like, you know, despite where we're at on this downward spiral, the solution is the same no matter what? We need to, in your, you know, opinion, the NEED Act is probably the one most accessible thing we can do. So now I want to hop into, well, before we get to the solution.
How do we know like where we were at?
Okay, I mean, answer that, and then we'll get into it.
We're still, part of the issue with inflation is that you feel it relative to your position on the social ladder, right? It's not like a ship going down at once. It's not like a meteor happening all at once. Certain people feel it before other people feel it. People on the bottom feel it first. And so it takes longer for the people on the top to feel it. But the question is like, at what point do you get to where it just can't be ignored anymore. And I started paying attention to this. Like I first posted those pictures on my Instagram feed, those hyperinflation photos, in April of 2021. That's when I started freaking out. That's when I saw the comet like coming, so to speak. Or that's when I saw
April of 2021.
Yeah, that's when I first started freaking out about hyperinflation. And everything has gotten worse and worse and worse since then. Like I've been sitting here helplessly watching people complain about their gas prices going up, taking photos of their gas prices, and people talking about how they can't afford meat and how they're just like people moving out of their homes, especially in New York City. I left New York City because the rent is just too damn high. And like right now, I mean, in the US, it's definitely inflation. I don't think we're at hyperinflation yet. We're not at that point where the monetary supply is like, you know, growing every 2 minutes, 12 minutes, you know, every
right.
half hour or whatever. We're not that bad yet, but that's definitely where we're heading. I mean, like the really good article, the best article about this that you can read is from Occupy the Feds. Shout out to Occupy the Feds on Twitter, and you check out their Substack. They have a great article about how close we are to hyperinflation and how the actual consumer price index, I think it's like hovering around 9. It's getting close to double digits, but how in real life it's probably much higher than what they're reporting. And I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for this. It's not only I mean, first off, I mean, this isn't Biden's fault. This is bigger than Biden. All right, right. Trump. This is bigger than Trump even. I mean, like this really started in 1913 with Woodrow Wilson, but Trump's his sanctions, his trade issues definitely kicked this crisis off. The supply chain issues and the tariff wars, like that definitely started this inflationary process. And the thing is the blame that Biden needs to take for this is the fact that Biden hasn't stopped Trump's tariffs. He hasn't stopped Trump's trade war. As far as I know, as of January, like there's a moment we could have repealed it, but as far as we know, Biden has continued Trump's policies, as unpopular as they were, and no one's really criticizing from that. The other main thing that Trump has done is he's reappointed an extremely corrupt head of the Federal Reserve Bank in Jerome Powell, who was busted by Occupy the Feds for insider trading on Federal Reserve blackout periods. And this was huge on Twitter, but we're pretty sure that there's a gag order on the story because it didn't make any mainstream press. And then this was in February of just this year. And then Jerome Powell, he was still reappointed by the Senate regardless, just this past March. And
yeah,
so
and you were saying Daniel DiMartino Booth had that one tweet where she was saying like there's no way he couldn't have known what those blackout dates were. Like this is yeah.
And interestingly enough, the Fed actually replied. They actually had a press release. They replied, and I mean, they said that like these are mistakes. And there's a really good article in Wall Street Parade breaking down like the BS and their arguments about this too. So Wall Street on Parade and Daniel DiMartino Booth kind of picked up on it. But other than that, like it just did not get enough attention. It needs more attention. Like Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, is like he's investing in Blackrock stock, you know, as he's giving bailout money to Blackrock and as their stock goes up.
It's not conflict of interest.
And like, he's getting reconfirmed by the Senate, and he's getting grilled by the Senate, and no one's asking him about this. I mean, Liz Warren called him a dangerous man. That's the biggest understatement of the new century. Like,
yeah, dude. But I mean, Blackrock needing bailed out. Gordon, can you pull up what they're worth?
Yeah, like, I'll try. The public worth, yeah.
He's giving COVID money. He's giving, and he's like BlackRock doesn't need to get bailed out, but he's giving pandemic money, you know, to BlackRock, and it's just like,
so
his stock is going up on it.
BlackRock, and we were talking about this earlier, Harrison, where after the housing crisis, BlackRock and Vanguard and other of these investment firms, legislation was changed in 2012 to keep from the same problems that led to the housing crisis. So it allowed for these investment firms to start buying up affordable housing. And that changed the game. Now, what these companies are doing, and I'm not going to point fingers saying like, you know, they are the problem, but what I am saying is all they're building up is affordable housing. That means you don't have an actual key where you can get into your house. It's eventually smart grid affordable housing where you need biometrics, eyes or thumbprints or fingerprints in order to get into your house. And that's as long as you appease the system, appease the algorithm. That's what the smart grid, in my opinion, is doing. So again, Gordon, pull up that image. How much are they worth?
9.5 trillion in assets as of 2021 August.
They're not looking too good. Of course they need to be bailed out. Like, what the hell?
Well, what do they own? I mean, like, what do they really own? They own a bunch of houses that no one can afford to live in. They need money out of nothing because they don't own anything of any value.
Well, it's like monopoly, like, you know, it's monopoly money in a sense, but as long as the story and the agreement, like Charles Eisenstein talks about, like all money, regardless if it's fiat, regardless of where it comes from, it's still humans agreeing. It's an agreement among people. And what's interesting is when you can have 99% of the well, maybe that's a little inflated. Let's just say 80% of the population disagrees with the core tenet of the agreement, yet the agreement stands. Like that's the really, really interesting thing about it, is like you can still rebel against the agreement and be instrumental in holding up that agreement.
This is where it gets interesting. So Aristotle observed all the monetary chaos in ancient Greece, and he observed like the reforms of like Solon in Athens and Lycurgus in Sparta, and he saw how things got better once you had a state-run monetary system. And so Aristotle called his term for usury was called Krematism, and this is the systematic misuse of the monetary system. But Aristotle concluded that money exists by law, not by nature, not by custom. So money isn't found in nature. Like gold isn't money unless it's legally termed as money. So you can have customs. Like it can be normal for people to give seeds back and forth. You know, it can be normal for people to exchange cows back and forth. But once it becomes like legal, once it becomes law, you know, like, I mean, the original cuneiform was all about recording these original loans and these original debt. And so, I mean, debt is really the birth of writing. Debt is really the birth of consciousness in a lot of ways. That is really the birth of society, really, once you start getting into it.
Wow, because writing externalizes the mind. You know, it holds it like in a contract.
You can have a ledger.
You write it down, it holds it longer than if you were to just say the words out loud. So that's interesting that you mention it that way. And it just, when you said Krematism, it just makes me, for some reason, want to do some kind of meme parody on Kremet the Frog.
Yeah.
But that'll be later.
So the takeaway from this, though, is that like all these, you see a lot of solutions about the Fed, like alternative currencies, you know, digital alternative currencies, Bitcoin, crypto, even down to like, you know, people talk like Ron Paul, people talk about going back to a gold standard, for example. So you also hear people just talk about, you hear like, you know, anarchist people talking about like co-ops and just exchanges, move your money to a co-op, like all kinds of solutions. But the thing is that there has to be a legislative solution to the Fed. The Federal Reserve was created by a legislative act, an ignorant legislative act by Congress in 1913. But the Federal Reserve is a social problem that's going to take a legislative act to fix. Like you can buy alternative currencies, you can try to swap out, but you are legally bound to use money that the Federal Reserve creates in order to pay taxes. And so you are legally trapped in this system, like pretty much no matter what, unless you just know how to live off the grid. But the thing is that the Fed is paying developers. The Fed has unlimited amounts of money, just pay developers to eventually come find your grid and put you on it. So you can't like use that Henry David Thoreau solution of like, let's just go find Walden, let's just back out of the system and it'll collapse on itself if we don't use it. Like, no, the system is going to keep using you until you actually occupy it, until you actually take it back. And so
that's super interesting because, you know, you keep hearing this Bucky Fuller, Bucky Fuller and Einstein, like you can't solve a problem from the level of intelligence that created it. But in this sense, like it seems like the spell was created and there is a way of undoing the spell, right? It's almost like it does have its undoing encrypted into it. It's just like that self-destruct button needs to be pressed, that legislation needs to be created in order to bring this back to being state run. And it almost makes me think of the core of anarchy in general is basically it's localism. It's, you know, everything is run localism. Like, why have people thousands of miles from you who are not invested in and do not understand the trials, tribulations, and the ways to get along in life where you're at, creating policy for you. So, and I'm not even like espousing that we should move to anarchism, but that's actually what nationalism is. Instead of having this global monetary system where it all like global economic blocks where it all runs and operates in the same exact way, that's farther and farther from having any kind of real intelligible sympathy, empathy towards who this slave system or this system in general is affecting. So, I mean, there's one thing that I want to hop to, and that's another question. You know, you mentioned this one, like, why should BLM look up the Fed? What about climate activists, climate change activists? Why should they look up the Fed?
Well, the fossil fuel industry would be dead without the Fed bailing it out, just like the banks. You know, I mean, it's 100 companies creating 70% of the pollution by oil companies. Most of them, I mean, the American ones at least, are all getting money from the Fed. I mean, I'm sure the other international oil companies are probably getting bailout. Some of them probably getting bailouts from the Fed too, and they're probably getting bailed out from other central banks too. I mean, this industry, this corrupt, dirty, pollution-based industry would have given way to renewable solutions by now without the Fed. And if we had a nationalized Fed, AOC could fund all these new solar and all these new wind energy alternatives without having to tax rich people with sovereign currency. And let's talk about anarchy for a second, because I am an anarchist. And, you know, it is interesting for me being an anarchist, like arguing for this entity being brought into the Constitution. I mean, the monetary authority that would govern the Fed is essentially the fourth branch of government. You know, so like it talks about how like the government being a table, and right now we only have 3 branches. We need a fourth branch, a monetary branch, in order to make this government stable. And so it's weird for me being an anarchist, like actually fighting to make government better, to make more government in a way. It's a certain irony, certain hypocrisy when you think about it at first. But I mean, the thing about anarchy that I always liked, you know, studying like Noam Chomsky or Emmett Golden, especially the American anarchists. I find the European, Spanish anarchists a bit more didactic, a little bit looking for my maxims. Property is theft and all that. Like, debt is theft. You know, those anarchists were pretty monetarily illiterate. So was Karl Marx. I'm a Max Weber. I'm a Weberian sociologist. He was well aware of this stuff. He was way ahead of his time. But and that was a major critique of Marxism too. Weber being the author of Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, far and away the most cutting-edge thinker on the left, even to this day, even though he's been dead for about 100 years. But so, I mean, but as an anarchist, like the thing that brought me to anarchy was the way that certain anarchists like Emmett Goldman or Noam Chomsky just sort of focused on problems and their solutions. They didn't really get into like a theory. They didn't have like a moral kind of stand. I mean, like it's pretty. You could argue that there's a horizontalism in all those. The horizontalism was the big word, the big synonym for anarchism at OWS, which I agree with. And the irony of that, though, is that, you know, most anarchist circles in New York City, like most of these anarchist sites, they're totally non-horizontal. They're totally condescending. They're totally patronizing. They're totally didactic. Like there's nothing horizontal. They're total hierarchical, little mini hierarchies with the hypocritical hierarchies within the OWS anarchist communities that, I mean, also why I had to back away from that. In addition to the fact that they don't care about the Fed. You know, these communities, they focus on capitalism, ending capitalism. But they kind of got stuck in a cat and mouse game with the NYPD, and they didn't really focus on exposing how Wall Street actually works. And if they had, you would have come across the Fed. There's no way around it. But as an anarchist, focusing on monetary reform, focusing on the Fed, the big thing that I've come to discover is that the proper role of government is to create money for its citizens to use rather than for laws for them to follow. That's what a good government should do. It creates money. That's it.
Interesting. I hadn't heard of that.
Control. You know, you got to give people something like positive to work for, and to like if you give money, you put money into the system, people stop acting like animals. Like all the crime, all the debt, all the crime in the country, all crime comes from money, just like all wars come from bankers' wars. Like in 2018, there was just under 60 trillion worth of total debt, government, household, individual debt. But at the same time, there's just under 16 trillion worth of actual money in the system to actually pay off all that debt. Like if every person, every government, every business paid off all their debt, there would be absolutely nothing in our system to use as a means of transaction, because we don't have a monetary system. We have a debt system.
Yeah. I want to then understand like two aspects of this. What are some action steps you believe that people can take? Let's just focus on the NEED Act, nationalizing the Federal Reserve. What are some action steps people can engage with to on the individual level? Because I know so many people, they feel like this is beyond me. Like I don't have a hand in any of this. So I'm just going to sit back and watch, you know, and hope for the best and cross my fingers. So I would love to know some action steps. And then also, let's say it's successful. Let's say people engage with it, that we successfully nationalize the Federal Reserve. What does that look like, and what happens to the debt, and how does that affect foreign relations where we owe massive debt? So I would like to understand, like, how do we get to that point, and what does it look like once that happens? Let's just give it that, you know, manifesting verbiage saying, let's say it happens. You know, how do we get there? What are the most efficient action steps to get there? And then what does that look like if the United States does that, and the United States is responsible for, you know, monetarily enslaving many other countries with debt and putting them under the same exact kind of system? If we were to change, how does that look when we owe, I forget what our federal deficit is, or, you know, like how much debt we actually have, but you get what I'm saying. Like, how do we get there, and what does it look like once we get there?
So the first question, how do we get there? That's what I specialize in. That's my specialty. We're not going to get there without a movement. We need a monetary reform movement. We need a monetary reform revolution. We need version 2 of Occupy Wall Street, and we need to be at the Fed. And the good news is that's happening really well. At first, I thought it was just me. You know, I was the only guy out there at the Fed. But these new people with Occupy the Feds on Twitter, please follow them. Please follow me on Twitter. That's the first thing you can do. But they've gotten over 11,000 followers on Twitter just since they exposed Jerome Powell for this, and people are listening. People want this to happen. You're not alone out there if you're sick of debt slavery. Like there are other people out there. We're starting to get together on social media. I had a really good week on social media. The AMC investors, they call themselves the Apes Stronger Together movement, because they bought out AMC, Planet of the Apes. Yeah. So they're smart. They want to occupy the Fed too. They're starting to jump behind our next demonstration at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for the 5th of November. So shout out to all the apes out there. Thank you for investing in those stocks and screwing over the short sellers. It's awesome. They're doing a better job of regulating the banks than the Fed or the SEC. So it's an honor to have them start to pay attention to the Federal Reserve and to want to occupy it. Like it's great to see that they want to see a long-term solution as well. So there's no right way to be involved in the movement. You don't have to give up your life for this and become an organizer like me. Like, really spread the word, spread the link to this podcast. please follow me on Twitter. Please RSVP. Just type in Occupy the Fed on Twitter. You'll see the event. Please say that you're going, even if you can't actually be there. Just if you say that you're going, someone else will actually show up because you're there. And then look, the real movement isn't even at the Fed that day. It's all the people who are watching online, who are going to follow us on live stream and on live tweet, and who are going to actually call the representatives to get this done. Like, we don't need to actually storm the Fed. We don't need any violence. We don't want any violence. That'll set us back further. Yeah. It's really just about starting a rational conversation with Congress and forcing Congress to do their jobs. And just Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 of the Constitution states that Congress has the right and indeed the responsibility to create and regulate money in this society. And that's just what we need. We just need what we're already supposed to have. And then what does it look like? So that's the second question.
Yeah.
If you're interested in that, I encourage you to check out the Alliance for Just Money, monetaryalliance.org. They have coffee houses every month, sometimes more. They talk about this, and I've heard a few conversations about what would happen once the United States nationalizes its debt. So, I mean, obviously, if we pass the NEED Act, then the United States, in theory, wouldn't need any of these other countries to pay any of that money we lent them back. So I imagine the NEED Act would entail, it's not stipulated in there. I mean, this is part of where it becomes a social science experiment. Like, this is something I want to see. What is going to happen to the international debt system once the NEED Act passes? But I mean, these certain countries that are dependent on U.S. cash, I imagine they would no longer need to pay that back. Moreover, these countries would now have a precedent. I mean, why would they pay that back? Why wouldn't these countries just take over their central bank, create their own version of the NEED Act, and create their own sovereign currency so that they don't have to use our money anymore? Like, why wouldn't they do that? Like, I mean, there's probably certain countries that for various reasons wouldn't be able to. But what I expect to see, with the monetary, there is an international monetary reform movement as well. It's called the IMMR. You can check their website out. But there are international monetary reformers out there who talk about this. And to get more into it, I specialize more in the first part of your question on how do we get the Fed nationalized, how do we get the NEED Act passed. But once you get this done, I mean, every country has its own sovereign currency system. We focus on that localism, that anarchist principle, that libertarian principle of local money, like money for the people, by the people, indeed. And hopefully the United States sets this precedent. I mean, hopefully we see countries like North Korea, like just kind of ousting their dictators, not only setting up constitutions, but setting up their own currencies. And that's what we want to see. We want to see people all over the world take control over their own money and their own monetary systems. So, and that has to happen. Like, I mean, that if one country does this and other countries, I mean, I don't know. It's just going to be a domino effect.
Yeah. The last question I want to ask you and fully understand is, first, I see the anonymous masks behind you, and I have to say that your mustache, your goat, and your beard, it just naturally grows like that.
Yep, it does.
Yeah, and so, the question, in all seriousness, that I want to ask is, in your opinion, having been one of the founding members of Occupy Wall Street, having been there, day in and day out, what was their strength and what was their weakness? Like, what held them together and allowed for the sum of their parts or allowed for the magic that they brought to be larger than the sum of their parts? And then also, what was their undoing? What were their strengths that if a movement starts up, like you're talking about, a monetary reform movement today were to start up, learning from both the strengths and the weaknesses of Occupy Wall Street, what would it be?
That's a great question, and I wish I had like a few more days, years to think before responding. But the main virtue of my fellow organizers, even the ones I hate, even ones I honestly like would not want to talk to ever again. They had a lot of courage. We all had a lot of courage. Courage was the main thing. We didn't know what the hell we were doing, but we just did it. And we shoot first. Sometimes you just got to shoot first, ask questions later. Sometimes you just got to make a mess, throw some spaghetti against the wall, and you got to see what sticks. Because we didn't know what we were doing, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I knew I didn't. When I got into it, I knew I didn't know what I was doing, and I looked at it as an experiment, as a way to learn and to figure it out. And I learned how to organize and how to do stuff from it. The courage was the main thing. The creativity was enormous. Some of the most creative stuff you've ever seen, like, the puppet guild alone, like giant puppets roaming through the street. Like a giant puppet of the Brooklyn Bridge after 700 people get arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. Just so meta. So the art, the street theater was really what made Occupy unignorable. And so a combination of courage and creativity, but the downside was obviously the monetary illiteracy. It was the lack of homework. It was the lack of discipline. And it was, you really have to blame the media and the NYPD really for messing up Occupy Wall Street more so than the organizers. The NYPD knew what they were doing. They unloaded their jails. They sent lots of dangerous people down to the occupation, telling them that they could get free food down there. And the media started to cover this. And this is why the occupation lost the support of mainstream America. In October, Bloomberg tried to evict OWS, but it didn't happen because all these people came down to the occupation, and all these people made phone calls. Bloomberg's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from his constituents telling him to leave Occupy Wall Street alone. So that's how we know phone calls will work. But honestly, the best thing about Occupy is that it never actually ended. Occupy Wall Street is Black Lives Matter. Occupy Wall Street is Me Too. Occupy Wall Street is Extinction Rebellion, especially in New York. It's a lot of the same faces, a lot of the same circles. And so, you see how these movements inherited monetary illiteracy from Occupy Wall Street. These movements don't really know their enemy because Occupy didn't really know its enemy too. And so, the strength, the major weakness of Occupy was obviously its monetary literacy. But the good news is that Occupy never ended. A lot of people like me are still active or in different causes. We've had lots of other victories. I took everything I knew from Occupy and I applied that towards the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which was written by my good friend Doug Green, who unfortunately died like 2 years. This guy worked so hard. He would literally get up at 4:20 a.m. in the morning to start doing legal initiatives on this bill. And he just pushed himself to the point where one day he just collapsed after a Fish concert and fell right in front of I think it was the E or the C train coming down in Strawberry Fields Park. And he didn't get to see his bill passed. He literally died for the cause. But I took Occupy stuff. I took all the tricks I learned from Occupy and I threw a movement. And Doug actually, the height of the movement for him was probably a lot of the work that I did in Occupy. It turned this cannabis legalization stuff from just a bunch of phone calls into an actual movement in the street. We got more phone calls. And I brought so many stoners down to the Fed over the years. I've smoked mad weed. I've tripped mad psychedelics, mad mushrooms, LSD, MDMA in front of the Fed. And we've had, so we're going to do this. This is happening. There's the most authentic punk rock band in New York City. They're called the Resistance Company. They played at least half a dozen shows in front of the Fed with me already. We've had minimal coverage from Russia Today, RT, but all that footage got taken down once Russia invaded Ukraine.
Because RT went down.
Yeah, so we lost a lot of the work we did, a lot of the footage of a lot of the demos that we've had at the Fed, a lot of the mainstream footage, but it's getting bigger. This November 5th is the best demo I've had yet, just because of the 8 movement, because of the Occupy the Fed getting behind us. So the conversation in this country is going to change. And I think moreover that I think a lot of the interpersonal hostility, the interpersonal toxicity within this country is going to diminish once people start to focus on the Fed, even before we nationalize the Fed, I think things are going to get better in this country. Just having a movement against the Fed, I think will temporarily reunite the left and the right in a mutual stance of indignity. This is something we can all agree on.
Yeah. We've got some great questions from the audience.
Good.
You guys want to just take a few, Harrison? One of the big ones is Monsanto is obviously in the news right now, patenting seeds. And you talked about how seeds were used as an early form of, I think, currency or exchange.
Yeah, money. Seeds were money at one point.
Right, yeah. So how does Monsanto patenting of seeds and tying in with sort of the WF and Klaus Schwab and their policies, how do those two major organizations, such transnationals, really tie into the current monetary policy?
I would have to do more specific research, I doubt Monsanto needs money from the Fed, but
right.
All these companies all have to continually find new ways to make more and more money to pay off their debt. They're making more and more debt as money to pay off debt that they're own. Like Monsanto isn't necessarily a greedy, evil corporation. We're living in Monsanto is constantly getting squeezed for money by the system itself. And so Monsanto constantly has to take and to own and to take more and more constantly. So if you stop the Fed, you stop Monsanto. Like if you nationalize the Fed and you nationalize these central banks and you inject money freely into society so people don't have to work as slaves for it. They can work, as minimally as they need to for it because it's freely available. Why would Monsanto need to keep patenting things and taking things in order to keep making more money off of us?
Gotcha.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, go ahead and give the other questions then.
So another question was, how does the size of our current military affect the current system / Fed policy and some of the things you're proposing, just because we're such a large, world power from a military standpoint?
I mean, the military, obviously I don't have specific statistics or direct, but just logically, the military is inflation. War is inflationary. All wars are bankers' wars. The military is monetary policy. The military, the Fed is military policy. Put it that way.
Wow.
Yeah, to me, it just really seems like, so tell me if this is correct or not, but power elite basically buying up all real assets with fake debt.
Yeah. That's exactly how, look, people think that white people took the United States of America away from indigenous people through guns, superior technology. It wasn't. It was disease more so than anything, but even more so than disease, it was debt. There's this Thomas Jefferson quote about how, they gave them all these trinkets, all this these blankets with smallpox, all this booze, some guns that they can go get furs. And then they say, hey, you didn't pay us enough. You didn't give us enough furs yet. You're still in debt. You still owe us more. You keep owing us more.
Right.
And so the whole point of this was to get them to give up land in order to pay off those debts. That was always the point. This country was stolen through debt. It's always, what could be more real to your infrastructure than the land that your infrastructure is built on? And so it's all stealing, buying real infrastructure with money that's not real.
Right. Gotcha. And then, so to clarify, just for the audience, for solutions, is public banking the same as nationalizing banking?
It's not. That's a great question. And we've argued pretty vehemently with them. What would the point be of having a state bank? What's the point of having a state bank like North Dakota circulate private debt money? That's still just, you have a private bank keeping, you're in debt slavery to a private bank now versus to a state bank versus a private Wall Street banking cartel. And the Bank of North Dakota, Ellen Brown's personal example, they still have an account with the Federal Reserve. They still get money from the Federal Reserve just to redistribute to these really, racist Republican North Dakota communities.
Gotcha. And this is a little off topic, but it's in your lane. So your PhD is involving the erotic arts and specifically things with erotic hypnosis. Curious, just sort of What speak to that a little.
That was a few dissertation topics ago.
Okay, he's one of the audience. But
yeah. I was doing initially. My dissertation was on the difference between BDSM, like in the club, and sadomasochism in everyday life, and that just kind of naturally led to the Fed.
Interesting. That makes sense.
The Fed is kind of erotic. I don't know about you guys, but this conversation got me going. So.
You want to talk about domination? You want to talk about
just watch billionaires or billions.
And let's talk about the Freudian component to this too.
Yeah.
Like, why do these banks need to keep creating more and more money? Why do they need bigger and bigger bonuses? You know, what are they fucking paying for? Cocaine and hookers, like prostitution. Like there's not an invisible hand driving this market. It's an invisible phallus. Right. And you can see this in Zarlenga going all the way back to ancient Greece. The first recorded use of gold as money was to pay for temple prostitutes, according to Zarlenga in this book. And so you can see how, like, this debt slavery, like, what's the point of this? Like, why put people in debt slavery? And you get to this idea that Nietzsche has in the second genealogy of morals, where he talks about the pleasure of mastery through the pleasure of violation, like that pleasure of control. And so it's this.
This is rape language as well.
Yeah.
So this is why the Federal Reserve is a sexist issue. This is why Me Too needs to occupy the Fed. Go ask what's her name? Catherine Daly, I think, at the Atlanta Fed. Go ask her. Go ask Janet Yellen what it's like being a woman at the Fed. Go ask Suzanne Collins and Raphael Bostich, the new Fed president. Go ask them what it's like being black in these institutions that it's like pretty much all staunch white male economists. And, like, you know, the lack of diversity in these places is directly related to the fact that certain communities are getting more money and certain not. Like, Occupy the Feds on Twitter, again, they have this great leak. They leak these documents where the CEO of the New York Fed is talking about how they're worried about high income residents leaving the Lower East Side, the second district of New York, but they don't give a fuck about the lower income people, the black people, the women, like, they, you know.
Yeah, woke capitalism.
Wow. Yeah. You said to me earlier, like, you can't consider yourself woke, even in the most, like, positive light of that word, if you don't understand the Fed, if you're not looking at the Fed, if the Fed isn't the central focus of what you're looking at, because everything else, it's almost like you're trying to change your diet and do more sweats and soaks and cold baths when you're living in a house filled with mold. You're not remediating the mold. Like, the cause would be the Fed, as you're saying. And it's really, really interesting. You know, maybe next time, I don't know how deeply you've gotten into this, but when you look at the understanding of what magic is, most people think magic, and it's just like, well, magic is just this shit that doesn't actually exist. It's just this hocus pocus that you put in movies, and it has nothing to do, like, words don't have more power than you think they do. Symbols don't have more power than you think they do. Getting people wrapped up in the complexity of ideas and agreements, it doesn't have more power than it seems on its surface or on the face of it. But in truth, as you said, religions were like the priesthood was the origin of banking. And if you look at the origin of Judaism and the understanding of math and the understanding of numbers, the understanding of language and the power of it, and the understanding of just the orientation of symbols and what they mean and why our dollars have such symbols on them, why they have for such a long amount of time. What we're talking about is deeply psychological. It's a lot deeper than most of us give it credit for. What would you say to that?
I play capoeira. I read Alan Moore. I know magic. The Federal Reserve is black magic. It is evil, dark, black magic. It's not a natural thing. It's a con game. It's a sleight of hand. It's smoke and mirrors. Definitely. It's black magic, and it's gonna take some real good, like, actual, I don't want to say white magic. I mean, capoeira is black magic, but it's gonna take
Yeah, benevolent magic.
Transcendental magic.
There is you can't have a movement without having a spiritual component to that movement. You know,
Yeah.
it's going to take medicine in order to deal with this black magic. And, you know, half the reason I never would have had the brain power, I never would have had the neurons in my brain to figure this stuff out, you know, if I didn't have enough good fresh fruit and vegetables, and if I didn't have enough cannabis and enough psilocybin and MDMA and LSD in order to really get the neurons firing. So, like, it's hard. The people who are most affected by this issue, who are most drained and strained by debt slavery, have the least amount of magic in the brain left to understand this. You know, and so that's why it's up to people like us, you know, who have some privilege, who have some extra time, who, you know, we have to really talk about this, because the media is not going to educate us on this issue. Like, they don't have a financial incentive. Like, it's really just us. So I really thank both you, Ben, and Gordon for having me on the show to talk about this stuff tonight. And
yeah, man,
this is really going to help me promote and make my action on November 5th a lot more real. And I hope your audience will climb on board and help Mike check us a little bit so we can all get our money.
Yeah, man. Well, you crushed it. Really, this was such an intriguing and practical conversation to have. So I really appreciate your time coming on here.
Anytime, brother. Anytime you need me here. We'll have more to talk about. For
sure. And I think next time we can go down some rabbit holes that go deeper into, like, the solutions with a spiritual element to them. Yes. I think, you know, you could definitely speak well to that. So the last thing I want to say is just, like, give the audience, I know you already mentioned the November 5th Occupy the Fed in New York. Any more details on that, or anything else you want the audience to know, how they can engage with you, or just last words that you would like to give them before we part?
Let me just say thank you to your audience. Thank you. Follow me on Twitter. Follow Occupy the Fed on Twitter. Follow Ben. Follow Gordon on Twitter. Hit us up on Facebook. Occupy the Fed. That's it. Solving this is so easy. Once we're done with this, once we get the Fed nationalized, we're gonna be like, damn, why didn't we do this sooner?
Yeah. Well, man, I really appreciate that. Honestly, that's what I love about having this podcast, is that it's such a great platform to be able to talk about so many different topics. And I just have to say, as we're wrapping up here, that this conversation is something that hit me out of left field. You know, I did not expect to find myself back in the heart of looking up the Fed, what it is, why we should understand it, talking about the monetary system as being, you know, debt slavery. It's very interesting how you can learn about something, let it go for a while, engage with all these other topics, and then all of a sudden it just comes back and it hits you almost like it has its own life cycle in a way.
It takes time. It takes time. It takes some time. Yeah. And I know there's things I should probably be saying right now that I haven't quite figured out words for yet as well. You know, like it takes time.
Well, we'll get you back on the show once you figure those words out, man.
I'll keep studying.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's Harrison Schultz. Such an interesting mind, able to put what seems to be very complex topics into practical steps that we can engage in, and understanding why this is really it's a way to address the cause rather than addressing all of the symptoms, which it's hard to in such a complex life, such a complex world. It's hard to even understand what we're engaging with and what is priority number one. This is obviously priority number one for most of us to start engaging in. And that's why I'm super glad that we had this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here every single Thursday at 5 p.m. I know we took off a couple of weeks, but we're back. 5 p.m. on Eastern Standard Time, Thursdays. We're having these conversations so we can hopefully not just illustrate the nuances of what the problems are, but really talk about solutions. That's the main reason why we're here, and also to engage with community. And that's another thing we're talking about today, is community isn't just here to get to start listening to music and dancing around fires. Sometimes it really is putting out some of those proverbial fires as well. So get engaged and go on the Discord chat. Let's, Gordo, let's make sure we have something talking about specifically this, so we can start the conversation, so we can make sure we can get people out there to occupy the Fed on November 5th in New York. So we can make sure that people are putting their, literally like their money where their mouth is, and putting the rubber to the road, so we can stop just talking about what would help and actually engage with it. Because the number one thing that I see is a lot of people intellectually, they have things figured out, but they don't have some kind of, what is that word? Courage, right? That Harrison was talking about, the courage to actually put yourself in the line of fire, put some skin in the game, really get involved and push yourself outside of the, you may have some categories of things that your bucket list items. I've always wanted to do this, that, and the other, but pause for a second. Listen to that calling deep down inside you. When you hear some new information, listen deeply, pause, because you can hear if there's something authentically that's calling you, and it doesn't have to be based upon logic or rationale. Sometimes it violates all the logic and rationale that you've accrued through the life, the years of your life. But the calling is more fundamental than that rationale. Listen, allow it to carry you, allow it to move you. And sometimes you will find that it's what breaks you out of the rigidity that's been holding you back from the solution that's been before you this entire time. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my rant, and I'm sticking with it. Thank you so much, Harrison. Thank you, Gordon. And I'll catch you all next time on the Ben Stewart Podcast.